Today on Portable Magic, I'm talking to Sherryl Clark. Sherryl has more than 70 children's and young adult books published, including 4 verse novels. As well as writing, she teaches creative writing, and she's done that for a long time, so we'll talk a lot about that, what we've seen over the last 30 years. She's now a full-time writer and an editor and manuscript developer. And if that isn't enough to do, as well as all the younger writing she does, she also writes a lot of adult crime fiction. Now, Sherryl, is it true to say that to be an adult crime writer, you have to watch a lot of TV?
I think you have to read a lot of crime novels. I would say, for me anyway, that one of the things I've gained from reading is that sense of how to put a plot together, how to create red herrings, how to very subtly lead the reader down the wrong road a little bit, and then pull it all together at the end.
Is that the biggest difference, do you think, between writing for children and young adults, that red herring and pulling it together? And adults?
I think it's more about complexity. So my first adult crime novel probably took me about 10 years, and I can see from looking back that each draft grew deeper in character complexity and deeper in plot complexity, and there's a lot more room for setting and description, and particularly in crime fiction, I find place is really important. It almost becomes a character in the story. And all of those things, after having written children's books for a really long time, it took me a while to just develop all of those things in a much deeper way and allow myself to use a lot more words. Whereas, with children's books, you're always thinking, is it too long? Is it, do I need to cut it back? Am I aiming at the right age group? So you've got all those questions in the back of your mind, I think, in children's books.
What led you to go from, I know you're still doing children's books as well, but what led you to do adult crime writing?
It was actually where I started. So some of my very first short stories published back in the late 80s and 90s were crime stories. And I have a couple of awful crime novels in my bottom drawer. And I kind of started writing children's books through going to a workshop with Meredith Costain, and she just kind of set me on the right path and said, that works, keep doing that, and that's what I've kept doing.
And what was your first book actually published?
The Two Type Tutu. So
was that a Penguin? Was that a Penguin book?
It was one of the first 6 Aussie bites, and I just happened to send it. It had been rejected elsewhere, and I just happened to send it to Penguin just as they were looking for 6 stories to start the Aussie Bite series. They weren't even called Bites then. They were nameless at that point. And it landed on their desk. It was the right length. They didn't have a ballet story, and that's where it all started.
And did you totally stop doing adult stuff and just concentrate on children writing and young adult writing after that?
For a while. I also kept writing adult short stories now and then, and I also have always kept writing poems for adults. I do that all the time, and then returned to the crime fiction. I looked back in my notes. I finally found the original notes for the first crime novel, which is called Trust Me, I'm Dead, and that wasn't the name it originally had, but I knew that it had started from a little tiny thing I'd seen in an article in The Age, and I had kept it, and I found the notebook where I sticky taped it in with the ideas and then some kind of very early rough draft stuff. And that was years before I actually completed the first draft. So it had been kind of vegetating in the back of my mind for a long time. And then I finally wrote a draft, and from there away it went. So yeah, on and off, on and off.
So Cheryl, as I mentioned earlier, 30 years of writing and teaching writing. How important has it been for you to stay adaptable, given I can't begin to imagine the amount of changes you've seen in that time?
Oh, well, one of the ways I have stayed adaptable is through teaching, because you constantly have to be updating your information for students and making sure that what you're telling them is accurate, and staying very aware of what publishers are looking for, again, so that you can pass that on to students if you see a manuscript that's, you know, possibly ready for publication. Not always, but occasionally it happens. And just generally doing a lot of reading, getting a lot of industry newsletters. I'm always interested to know what's happening both here and in America. So belonging to the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators for many years has been really useful. And yeah, things have changed. There's a lot more people, of course, writing and wanting to be published. Still, a lot of people don't read and therefore don't understand where the industry is now. Like, even if you look at picture books, you can see even in the last 20 years how much picture books have changed, how much the growing visual literacy of young children has meant that the illustrator, for example, has a much greater role, and you know, we're seeing a lot more wordless picture books, for example. But ironically, and I always felt like ebooks for kids would never really take off. People were saying it's the next big thing. We're all going to make apps for picture books. Nobody's going to want a picture book anymore. It's all going to be apps on the iPad, and it never came to pass, because there's nothing like holding the book in your hand and reading to a little kid on your lap, and that whole thing that a book does, which is that it lets you into the story and your imagination takes over and you become part of the story. And I just think that's so important for kids to experience. It's what, to me, grows a love for books, is being swept away by a book. And all the apps that I've seen, it was like they were trying to do all the work, and there's nothing left for the child to do but be an audience, which is so different from television. So I think that's probably part of the reason why the apps failed. So that change has certainly happened. I've become quite dismayed about the prevalence of series in the middle years at primary school, and how much they've just consumed the market. And there's a lot of people writing really good standalone novels, and they're just not getting, and they're either not getting published, or if they are, they're not getting a look in terms of marketing. So yeah, I think that's become an issue, and I've heard librarians talk about that as well. So another change, not for the better.
What about, because I have a few theories on what hasn't changed. What do you think hasn't changed in writing and publishing?
I still think that there's a lot of great publishers who are trying to do really good things. It seems that there's always room for a new small publisher to kind of rise up and establish themselves and do something a little different. I think probably a firm press has done that really successfully. I think there's a lot of really passionate editors and librarians and booksellers out there who love children's books and promote them and do as much as they can with them, and that certainly hasn't changed. So, yeah, that's some of the things.
Yep. I think too, the basics of a good story, like, you know, the crafting of a good story, that hasn't changed. Doesn't matter how you're telling a story, whether it's picture book, whether it's a junior novel, or whether it's something for TV, story is story. And I think we all will always have a thirst for story.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And children especially. And again, you know, the story that invites them in and takes them away is just so important, as well as the story that shows other people's experiences and other people's lives. And, you know, there's a meme going around, has been for a long time, that talks about fiction as a way of teaching understanding and compassion. And I totally believe that, you know, that's where you get to feel what characters unlike you are feeling and how their lives exist so differently to your own, you know.
One of the things I say to younger readers, and I think it freaks them out a bit, it's kind of like the author, in a very subtle way, is taking the child by the hand and going, I'm going to show you this really horrible thing, but it's going to be okay. They sort of look at me like, don't hold my hand. But you know what I mean? I think that's the safety of books. You can touch all sorts of areas and the child's quite safe and learn so much from it.
Yes, and television's not the same, because you're kind of stuck there and it can be almost hypnotic, and then you're seeing stuff that you don't want to see, and the images are so vivid. You know, I can understand. I had nightmares for years from things that I'd seen in the movies, because my nana used to take me to the movies before I started school, and I can still remember one science fiction horror thing she took me to. I haven't been able to find out what the name of it was, but it was a robot that was going around killing people. So very appropriate for a 4-year-old.
Oh, God. And it scars you. I still can't watch Doctor Who today because of those Daleks. God, they terrified me. So it does scar you.
Yes.
Sherryl, when you were a child, apart from being terrified by your grandmother at movies, what kind of books influenced you?
The first book I can remember having that was on my own was The Magician's Nephew, which was the C.S. Lewis Narnia, one of the Narnia books. That had a big influence on me, as did I loved the Swallows and Amazon series. So where I went to primary school, we had the school library service. So we didn't really have a library of our own. Every 3 months we'd get all these boxes of books from the school library service. So you'd pack up all the books from the last lot and send them all back, and then you'd get all these boxes of new books. And that was kind of my revolving library. And then when I was about 11, I was allowed to join the big library in town, and Mum would take me in to bring home all these books. So I think that's where I got onto Swallows and Amazons, and I think Cousins had the Just William books, which I know Morris Sleitzman talks about as an inspiration. And there was some adventure series that I remember reading as well, probably from the library, but we didn't have much at home. We had a bookcase in the hallway which had books from my mother's childhood and from my grandfather that were very, very old. So someone older than me might remember the Campfire Girls. They were really boring, I have to tell you. I didn't read many of them.
My dad had, my sister and I were only talking about this the other day. He was into lots of colonial type things. So he had the Tigers That Ate People in India stories. There are about 5 books of those. My sister and I both devoured them. We were only talking because she's a lot younger than me. And I said, did you read them too? They were terrifying. Sherryl, what came first for you? Were you writing first or teaching first?
Oh, writing first, yeah. When I I probably started writing poetry when I was about 18. I never really did it at high school. I wrote poems to make people laugh. And then when I travelled overseas, I used to write really long letters to my dad, which probably gave him a heart attack. I did find some of them years later that he'd kept and nearly died at what I told him we were up to. But anyway, but I kind of was writing poetry and bits for a long time. And then when I moved to Melbourne, I joined a writing class at the old Footscray Women's Learning Centre. And it kind of started from there. And then through that, I ended up through the old Footscray TAFE doing a return to study course, and I went off and did a BA at Deakin through flexible delivery, which was literature and creative writing. And at that time, that was the only creative writing tertiary study you could really do. And then through that, I gradually started teaching in the community. So I worked in community arts for a long time, teaching workshops before I actually started teaching at TAFE.
What do you think your biggest takeaway after those years of teaching? What was the thing that you've learnt most about teaching about writing from teaching other people?
Probably that there are a lot of really good writers that I've come across over the years in my classes, but a lot of them never finished anything. So that would be one thing. If you don't finish something, then you don't go to the next step, which is rewriting and then perhaps publishing. On the other hand, I've seen people who were good writers, but not the best in a class, but they would be the really hard workers, the really determined ones, and then later I would see them getting work published. So, they say that writing is 90% perseverance, and that, in a lot of ways, that's pretty true. If you don't have the perseverance, it doesn't matter how good you are, and the perseverance applies to revision as well. Had a few students who wouldn't learn grammar and punctuation, because their attitude was, oh, well, the editor will fix that. And it's not just about that. If you don't understand how sentences are constructed, it really impedes the flow of your writing, because you actually can't see or hear when things are clunky or when they're not flowing. So it all kind of comes in together. It all is part of the same thing. And it's a great thing when you get students, and it often happens in second year, who will suddenly see how learning editing, which as you probably know, in the certificate and diploma of professional writing and editing one in first year is a core subject. And people always they grinding their way through it, and and it's something to be endured and got through with gritted teeth. But then you see them in second year suddenly going, now I understand how all of that applies to everything else that I'm writing, and to see that happen and to hear them say, oh, now I get it, it's great, because then yes, they really do get it.
Yeah. Yep. Do you think we ever stop learning as creators?
I don't think so. I think, and I've seen a few people say that they've stopped writing because they've got to the point where they either have felt like they know it all and there's nothing left to learn, or they've got to the point where the excitement of learning new things through writing is gone, and so they stop writing. I think learning is part of what keeps writing interesting.
Very much so. On that, you clearly are still loving learning because you're still prolific and busy writing.
Yes. Well,
Prolific
I
before
start,
COVID.
yeah, well, I started writing nonfiction about 18 months ago. One of our teachers had been working, I filled in for a class for her, and the class had been looking at writing articles for an online magazine called Medium. And I thought, oh, that sounds really interesting. So I went and found out more about Medium and decided to give it a go. And I think I've now published about 100 articles on Medium, mostly about writing, but about other things as well, and poetry and, you know, bits and pieces. But Medium's been great, and you can publish all kinds of things there, and you can earn a little bit of money. People that earn hundreds of dollars a month probably aren't writing what I'm interested in, but you know, it's still a good outlet.
Absolutely. And writing non-fiction is good too. It's just a good change from fiction. It's a different style of writing, and I think it's another way of honing your skill.
Yes, and you know, I've been teaching for, well, I don't know how many years altogether, but there was 23 years at TAFE before I finally, the compliance documents got the better of me and I had to leave. But in all those years of teaching, I've just felt like all of the things that I've been saying in a classroom for all those years, I could now, you know, turn them into articles and create a resource for people.
Yeah. So no teaching at all anymore?
Occasionally, I'm doing a free online workshop for Hobson's Bay Libraries next week on creating characters. Mm-hmm. So that kind of thing I'm still doing.
Oh, good. And it's good to have that contact, isn't it, with whether they're children writers, whether they're young adult writers or adults. It's lovely to have that, because I think you learn so much from people learning the craft as well.
Yes. And one of the things that I really think is important and I don't get to do enough of is teaching poetry writing in schools. And the schools where I've done it, the students have just done amazing poems. And what I love about poetry is that very often the kids that usually struggle in the class with story writing, because writing stories, you know, quite a big endeavour really, are great at poems, because you tell them no rules, write whatever you like, this is how you do it, more or less, go for it. And they write fantastic stuff, and it shows that everybody's got imagination. They just have to have the tools, and poetry gives them really simple tools, and they love it. So more poetry in schools, please.
Exactly. Sherryl, what are you working on at the moment?
My second crime novel came out last month. Yep. As an ebook at the moment, because it's published in the UK and over there the bookshops have only just reopened, so they've delayed the print edition a little bit more again. So I've just started on the third book in that series, and I'm about to start work on I've got a verse novel that's going to be published by the University of Queensland Press next year. So we're just about to start on the editing for that. So those are my two projects at the moment.
That's exciting. And QP are doing beautiful books, aren't they? There are some great books around. There really are.
Yep. Mm.
Beautiful. And are you finding, I know a lot of writers are finding this, that in COVID they're finding it hard to be creative, or are you able to keep going?
Initially, it was hard. It was like this huge dilemma. It's like, oh, you know, we're in lockdown. I've got probably 6 to 8 weeks. I could sit here and write 20 novels. And then the more you tried, the harder it got. And a lot of people were saying the same thing, that it was like they wanted to write, but when they actually sat down to do it, so many things kind of crowded in that the inspiration and the world just went out the window. So I kind of was already working on a novel then anyway, and I kept going, but it was hard. It was kind of like you leave it and then come back to it, and then I felt like the love for it wasn't there, and then because it was set in Finland where I did a residency last year, I went back and looked at all my photos of Finland and got my head back into it that way, and that helped. But I know a lot of people said the same thing. You just felt like, I started kind of feeling like, what's the point? You know? But anyway, get there in the end.
It's certainly a very strange time. Sherryl, it's been so lovely to chat, because usually when I see you, it's that fly-by sort of hi-bye. We don't often get to actually talk when we're at festivals and things. Thank you so much for your time today, and congratulations on all your work and your continued work.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me.